Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show, and we're going to be talking a little bit about a great new film that you really should be watching. Father Stu, starring Mark Wahlberg, with an especially good performance by Mel Gibson as Father Stuart Long's own father in this film. Great film, just coming out. You should be watching it. Here to join us, here to discuss that is someone who knew Father Stuart Long very well. Father Bart Tolleson is with us. And Father Tolleson, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Hi, good to be here, Ed.
So tell us a little bit about how you knew Father Stuart Long, and how you came to know who he was and what his story was.
Yeah. So Stu and I was a seminarian for the Diocese of Dallas. In the middle of seminary, some family had moved up to Montana, and my folks bought a place in Montana. So I discerned that I would like to become a seminarian for the Diocese of Helena. So in the middle of that discernment, I got in touch with Stu Long, who was a seminarian for the diocese, and we started emailing back and forth, and he gave me some advice. And then eventually, when I was accepted as a seminarian, I met him not too soon thereafter. In the summer of 2006, we met face to face. And we became friends pretty quickly, and we were in the same ordination class. Which means we were on the same schedule to be ordained, though we were in two different seminaries, and we kind of kept up that way.
So I'm sure you've seen the movie by this point in time. I've seen the movie, and one of the things that I love a good redemption story, Father. I'm Catholic, so I love a good redemption story, and Easter season's great for that. And by the way, happy Easter to you and to your congregation as well. But normally you hear redemption stories and they tend to get prettied up a little bit, especially when they're Hollywoodized, right? Because you don't want to make people too unsympathetic. This is, I think, maybe the first R-rated redemption story, involving, sort of faith-based cinema. And I mean, for good reason. I mean, it's authentic. It's apparently very authentic to Father Stu's life. But I think that speaks to where a lot of people are in redemption. And I think that's one of the values of having this film, right?
I think so. The first really rated R redemption story was Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson.
Well, that's true. Yes. Yeah. Very, very true. Yeah.
And then, of course, I think if it hadn't been for that film, they would have been maybe more reticent to go forward with particularly the language that gives it more authenticity, but makes it rated R. But it's a good time. I think Sony recognized it's a good time for a good Catholic redemption story. Stu's story is very unique because he is really one of those characters that came full, 180. I mean, he was an agnostic, kind of made fun of religion, lived a rough life, got into a lot of fights in the ring and outside the ring, and lived with a woman and did whatever the world said you should do, and kind of enjoyed his life. And then God just gave him some events to make him look up and inside.
I was kind of struck by it to some extent, sort of like the parallel to Augustine, although I think Augustine resisted longer. I think Father Stu responded to his calling as a Christian when it came. But
I don't know. Stu resisted for about 8 years.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So maybe it was closer to that. Maybe it is sort of a modern, I don't want to say retelling, because this is clearly Father Stu's own story, but I mean, it's sort of a modern parallel to that. And again, a parallel to the way a lot of us approach redemption in Christ.
Yeah. Stu, he just kind of stayed away from it. And, finally with that motorcycle accident, again, the invitation to consider faith before he had rejected them time and time and again. And this time, because of his broken body and something that happened interiorly, he said, I'll give it a try. And he got serious about it. And when he was baptized, he also felt like he had the call to the priesthood. And he spent another good long while, I don't know exactly, 8 to 10 years or so, kind of run away from that call that kept coming up in his life over and over again. Till eventually he said, enough, I'll go where God wants me to go.
That's very interesting because, I mean, when you commit things to film, it's a 2 hour format, basically for most films, 2 hours max. So you have to compress time, you have to compress some storylines. So in the film, it kind of happens one on top of the other. But in his life, this took a while for him to really discern this call properly.
It took a while for him to even respond to the call, and then not after that, he began the process of discerning. So he'd kind of been running away from the call, particularly to the priesthood, for a good long while, and had dated different women and trying to find someone that would talk him out of it. And finally, there was, I think, a woman that kind of talked him into it. And he quit his good job and started working at a Catholic school in California, moved in with a couple of Catholic guys, hung out with Catholic guys, got involved in pro-life work and some other things like that. And still didn't really get serious about the priestly call until a couple of his friends one day drug him to hear Father Benedict Rochelle. And hearing Father Benedict for the first time, it just hit Stu right between the eyes. And after that, he quickly made moves to go join Father Benedict's order in New York City. And after a couple of years of that, getting a master's at a Franciscan university in Steubenville, that didn't work out. The friars said, well, you've got some potential, but not here. You're pretty, I don't know if it was stubbornness or too set in his ways or too much of a wild card, but they did encourage Stu to go and pursue diocesan priesthood. So Stu went back to Helena, his hometown, and connected with the bishop. And from there, the bishop put him at Mount Angel Seminary to become a diocesan priest. And then after that, he really was laser focused on that call and that determination to become a diocesan priest for Helena.
Well, I think, obviously again, you can only tell so much in a 2 hour story, and there was a lot to tell. But I think that part of the story is equally interesting, right? Because I think that there's sort of this popular misconception, probably not quite as much among Catholics who should know better, that, the seminaries are so desperate that they'll reach out to anybody, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, discerning is on both sides of that. And I think it's revealing that the Franciscans at Steubenville were very specific about how they were discerning his track and still encouraging him to seek out the priesthood, but through a different, through a different window, if you will, a different door, if you will. I mean, you're certainly a priest. You've certainly been through this how this works. I think that's more typical than maybe people realize in this sort of mutual discernment process.
Well, I think just because of the recent history and of the Church of the United States, there's more attention paid to priestly candidates. Certainly, it started when I was a seminarian. They were looking at things very specifically and trying to raise the bar, so to speak. And right. Stu, when the friars in New York said no, he still believed he had a call. He was disappointed, but he lived his faith authentically, and no one could argue with that. Now, in seminary, sometimes he challenged ideas he did not agree with. And because he never backed away from a fight, he never backed away from an intellectual argument either, ever. And sometimes I think that, people say, well, he's not flexible enough. He's too myopic. He's too narrow-minded. And I think that was perhaps one strike against him in the seminary, though he authentically lived out the practice of the faith. And he encouraged his brothers in seminary, from the stories I've heard, to really lift them up, to challenge them, but to also encourage them to be good priests in training as well.
So this brings me to a point about the movie, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers because I want people to see the movie. But the movie again depicts some conflict between Father Stu and some of the other seminarians. One of these gets resolved very late in the film. I wouldn't say a whole bunch, but there's some resistance at the seminary, which I think must be sort of a telescoping of what happened at Steubenville to some degree. Is that accurate? I mean, I guess you're telling me at least in part it's accurate, because this is a man who defended his own perspective. But I mean,
I don't. Right.
Yeah.
Specifically, I don't know if it's literally accurate. I'm sure that there are guys that Stu went head to head with in the seminary. But I think in terms of like trying to take this whole guy's career, I mean, a good seminarian, even in Steubenville, he did very well, but also kind of not the typical mold of a seminarian guy. And sometimes that rubs people the wrong way,
Yeah.
both in seminary and even in his priesthood. And so you have these guys that are close to Stu, that are seminarians with him, that are priests with him, that are friends of his, and you have other stories about how he butted heads here and there. And so you're trying to take all of these characters and say, well, how can we tell the story? Well, let's just focus it on two characters that he gets to know in the church, and they go to seminary with him, and that will be the best way to tell the story. So that's what they did. I think it works. I mean, in terms of literalness, it not necessarily, but in terms of, yeah, these things happen, these themes, I think they got it right.
Right. And I think that, again, I mean, sometimes people get a little tripped up on historicity when it comes to, biography, film biographies. And again, because the format is very restrictive, you have to tell the stories that matter. And I think that this film really does tell the stories that matter. I think that so much of his life was of interest in this, that perhaps his priesthood actually gets a little too telescoped. And I'm kind of curious, because obviously you knew him. Tell us a little bit about his priesthood. You get a sense that he got a big response. And how was Father Stu as a priest? How was he with his with the parishioners, those that had the opportunity to work with him?
Yeah, they did telescope his priesthood. I think the point of the movie was to say, it's named Father Stu, so he's going to become a priest.
Right.
And that's kind of the goal of the film in terms of the narrative. And it was a goal of Stu's life. But then after that, he wasn't finished. Now, of course, he's ordained with this terminal disease, and everyone knew that. So they knew this was going to be a unique priesthood. He went back after we were ordained. He was assigned back to the Indian reservation, where he had served as a seminarian and as a transitional deacon, and did well there, but began to struggle, had a few falls, and there were some concerns. So they moved him to a single level rectory where he could do more. And he also was able to get, that's when his father, Bill, started helping him, sleeping on the floor of the rectory, doing all kinds of things for him. And we also enlisted a few others, one particular young man, to help Stu. And at that point, but then it got to be too much, to the point when the doctor said, you really need to be in a wheelchair full time. Then they moved him back to Helena, to Big Sky, which you see in the film. Now, when he got to Big Sky, I can remember going in just a day or so after he moved in. I said, Stu, what are you going to do? And he was like, I don't know. He was playing video games. And I was like, you know what? I got him going on where I was assigned. He came over and helped me at my parish. We were able to accommodate him very, very well at the church I was assigned to. And then got him going at the nursing home, celebrating Mass. And then from there, people just word of mouth, hey, there's this incredible priest over there at Big Sky. So what started off as like the first, maybe year, he wasn't so busy. You could pretty much get him at any time. Year after year, he got more and more popular. To the last couple of years of his life and his priestly ministry, there were lines every day down the hall to see Father Stu, because he delivered his priesthood with an authentic way that just hit you between the eyes, and he told it to you like it was. He had a great sense of humor until the end. He was joyful, but he was straight with you, and he didn't let you beat around the bush. He challenged you, and people liked that. And they were like, I can't argue with this guy. He's in a wheelchair. He's as broken as anybody, and yet his love for God is the most powerful that I've ever seen. So it really was a living testimony, and that's why people kept coming.
Well, and I guess you can even say that there's a parallel here to John Paul II, right? St. John Paul II, who really persevered through the latter, 2 decades really of his life with with Parkinson's disease, which physically incapacitated him, but mentally and spiritually, it was very strong. And I think that there is a powerful kind of testimony that goes with that. And I guess you can maybe tell us if Father Stu was thinking of those parallels as he was living out this life, or if it was just something that was natural to him because he was just such a fighter.
Well, I mean, Stu loved John Paul II, and he was devoted to John Paul II, mainly because of just his incredible work, theologically. And
Mm-hmm.
so I know when Stu was first diagnosed and there was some concern about whether or not he would be ordained to the priesthood, there was a prayer written, I think, by his godfather for the intercession of John Paul II. It was before even John Paul was a saint, was canonized. And so that prayer went around and a lot of people prayed it. But I think in the fact that Stu didn't get a physical healing, he certainly got an interior healing.
Right.
That he saw, I mean, you couldn't help but make the comparison that John Paul II carried his disease. He was determined until the end. Stu had that same determination. And certainly Stu would always encourage the intercession of the saints, both canonized and those he felt for sure would be saints. And so John Paul II was certainly in that group for intercession.
So again, we're speaking with Father Bart Tolleson, and Father, I mean, you were a friend of Stu's. You've seen the movie. Do you think that the movie really hit the mark? Do you think Mark Wahlberg really hits the mark in portraying your friend, not just your colleague, but your friend?
When you first see it, when I first saw parts of the film, I just laughed because it was like seeing these Hollywood stars play these individuals, Stu and Bill and Kathleen. It was funny to see on screen. But after a while, I was trying to, step away from it and say, what is it they're trying to do?
Right.
And they're trying to tell this incredible story and hit all the beats of Stu's life, particularly at least until he's ordained, a little bit after his priesthood. Hit those beats and demonstrate why this guy is an incredible guy and why his life is important. And I think they did it. It was, it's not literal, but there are many things that things he went through that they really got right. And that was pretty impressive. And the way Rosalind was able to distill certain long periods of Stu's life into like just a moment on screen or just with a few lines, I thought was very good. Well done.
Well, and look, I mean, I think that I think it's going to inspire a lot of people, and I think that Father Stu was already inspiring a lot of people known locally. I think this gives us an opportunity for all of those who never got a chance to go to confession with Father Stu or to talk with Father Stu or to receive the sacraments from Father Stu. Gives us a chance to get to know him as well, and I think that's going to be tremendously valuable. Have you talked to people in your community who've seen it, and how are they respond? I do take your point about kind of laughing because you know these people and you know them in real life, and there's obviously going to be a little bit of difference. But how are people in your community responding to the film?
I think for the most part, very positively. I remember the premiere they had in Helena a few weeks back. I mean, that theater was packed with everyone knew Stu. So it's like, I told them, I said, this is your toughest crowd right here. And let's see how you do, because, they knew Stu. And I was quite pleasantly surprised how many of them, like myself, just took it very positively and thought that they did a good job and realized this is a very complicated story to tell, and to distill it down the way they did. I felt like they brought honor to Stu's legacy, and that was a good thing. There are a few that aren't happy with it, that knew Stu pretty well. And that that doesn't surprise me because everyone has a different interpretation, but
Sure.
For the most part in his hometown, it's been very positive.
How does his family? I think his father's been doing some of the promotion, right? So they must be pretty satisfied with how it's turned out.
Oh, I mean, poor Bill and Stu's family, they walked with this thing for a long while because it's been in development for 6.5 years, almost 7 years this when we get to this summer. And so, it's like, is this ever going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. And then all the false starts and bad scripts or, unacceptable scripts. I think to finally get to a place where they feel like, they got it right. Maybe not literally, but got it right somewhat. I remember I was watching one scene with Bill and he kind of looks at me and goes, well, I don't remember doing that. I don't remember you doing that either. But he said it really well. Bill said, we go about it two different ways, the film stew and the real stew, but we get to the same place in the end. And I thought that was a great summation.
That is a great summation, and I think we're going to leave it there. Father Bart Tolleson, thank you so much for giving us your time, especially this in the octave of Easter. I was just mentioning it to him right before we started recording this, that this is like the busiest time to bother a priest with this stuff, and I really do appreciate you spending some time with us today.
All right, Ed. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay tuned for more from the Ed Morrissey Show. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show. Joining me again is Sarah Stogner. She is running for Texas Railroad Commissioner. She is in a runoff election. I keep wanting to say recall, and it's wrong. It's a runoff election on May 24th against a crowded field. Forced the incumbent into a runoff. Sarah, congratulations on that. That is in itself quite a victory for you.
Yeah, thank you. I feel good. I think statistically speaking, when you have a statewide candidate like this that doesn't win outright in the primary, they usually lose in the runoff. So
yep.
If history is any indication of success, I feel good. And I also feel good from all the feedback that I've been getting. People have been digging into him. They realize he doesn't have any substantive oil and gas experience and that he's a career-long politician. And I think people realize that the position is too important to have it be politicized.
Right. And just for those who are not in Texas, those who may have missed Sarah's first appearance here on the Ed Morrissey Show, the Texas Railroad Commission is an extremely important position, extremely important agency in the state. It runs oil, natural gas, and other energy initiatives. And so we're responsible for regulating it and making sure it's operating properly. It is an elected position. It's a very important elected position that doesn't have a lot of cognates in other states. This is somewhat of an unusual elected position for Texas. And right now, Sarah Stogner is running against it's Wayne Christian. I got the name correct, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Wayne Christian, who is a longtime incumbent and who failed to get to 50% plus one in the primary, Republican primary, which is itself rather surprising. And I think it does show that people here in Texas are actually serious about looking for a change, or at least taking a change under consideration. So Sarah is now the one and only candidate running against Wayne Christian in the May 24th runoff. And so you've got about a month to go. How's the campaign going for you?
Yeah, it's going really good. I'm making my way through the state. I'm in north of Austin tonight, in Round Rock. Tomorrow I'm in El Paso. Wednesday I'm back in San Antonio. Thursday, Friday, Corpus Christi, Houston. So it's a busy few weeks, but it's the home stretch and I'm feeling good.
And Sarah, just to remind everybody, you have a fairly extensive background in the oil and gas exploration, extraction business. You've been working as an attorney in this field for, is it 15 years now that you've been working as an attorney in this field?
Almost. Yep. I graduated law school at 2008. And so I've been representing energy companies in risk allocation and then suing insurance companies when bad stuff happens and insurance companies don't want to pay because it's cheaper for lawyers to fight than it is to pay the claim. And so when I moved out onto the cattle ranch last summer and had issues, I realized the only way you could fix it is from within. So I'm not accepting any campaign contributions. I'm running on actual substantive issues. 1/3 of the Texas economy is from the oil and gas industry. It's a vital part of the Texas economy and the US economy, as we're seeing with turmoil in Russia, right? And as we see a shift in Wall Street money and federal policy, all of those are coming into play and impacting pricing. And as crazy as it is, the oil and gas industry doesn't want $5 a gallon gas either, right?
Right.
Everything increases cost-wise for them as well. So we've got important issues, but we've got things like earthquakes that we need to address and groundwater contamination. And if we do it right, we can be clean. Natural gas is one of the cleanest sources of energy that we have, but we've got to do it the right way.
Right. And I think that this is one of the, it's a lot more complicated. This is a lot more complicated than just drill more or stop drilling. Right. And I think that this is an area that gets a little too simplistic. Now, I think that there's good reasons to want to have an elastic, dynamic domestic supply of both oil and natural gas, so that when you run into crises like what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine, or frankly, Russia over the last few years, Iran over the last few years, you want to keep oil prices lower anyway, in order to keep them from using profits and pouring them into more nefarious things. But at the same time, like you said, we also have to live in these areas where we're doing this sort of work. And so it becomes more complicated. It's a complex balance that has to take place. And obviously you're running because you feel that balance has been out of whack for a while here in the state of Texas.
Yeah, I think it's pretty well documented that most Texans don't know that the Railroad Commission regulates oil and gas and not railroads. And at this point, I think it's intentional, right? Like, there's no reason for the establishment to change the name, when it would be like, I always make the analogy of Wall Street electing the Securities and Exchange Commission and calling it the Banana Commission, or something that's
right.
completely unrelated to what they're actually regulating.
It really should be the Texas Energy Commission is what it should be. It's just evolved from the Railroad Commission, which was formed, I think, in about 130 years ago or so, here in Texas.
Late 1800s.
Yeah. So it's just evolved. They've just never updated the name, but it really should be the Texas Energy Commission, because that is really what they're regulating here in the state. So I did want to talk to you a little bit about Joe Biden's decision to really reverse himself and allow more leases to be sold. He's also increasing the price of the royalties off of that. It was a mixed bag, right? I mean, part of this is good news in that at least they're going to start allowing some other land to be leased out, which they had previously refused to do. But in other senses, it may not change a lot, because they're still putting the same restrictions, at least as far as I've seen. They're still keeping the same restrictions that Biden placed on that process in its Executive Order 13990. You've got the higher royalty rate, which is going to increase the cost of doing this. I think he kind of hit that sweet spot where everybody's kind of angry at him over this. Do you see this as really a step forward in terms of stepping up production? And if so, where are the opportunities to do that?
Yeah, well, look, first of all, for those listening that are in Texas, there's no federal lands in Texas. So I won't have any jurisdiction over this, just FYI. We're just talking general policy, right?
Exactly, yes.
And look, I think the problem is it's been inconsistency in messaging. And when he came into office 2 years ago and said, we're going to end the oil and gas industry, that doesn't give us a warm, fuzzy feeling. And although we knew that we were indispensable as an industry, Wall Street's been saying, you guys need to clean up your act. We're not going to loan or invest in oil and gas. And so it's made it much harder to get the actual capital needed to drill. So it's really a two-pronged thing. One, we need our politicians to stop using common sense energy policies as a bipartisan political issue. It shouldn't be. It should be more of a national defense beyond politics. And the other issue is we've got to get the Wall Street and the funding more comfortable, because it's a reality where you got to follow the money. And if there's no money, they can't drill. So regardless of however many leases he opens up, if we don't get the Wall Street on board, it's kind of irrelevant.
Well, and this is part of another issue, right? And I think this is another part that is vastly misunderstood, is that people look at, like ExxonMobil and Shell and, BP and some of these things, and look at the gross dollars of their profits, or even sometimes just the gross dollars of their net profits, without looking at the margins, right? But I mean, that's one thing. I want you to talk about the margins, but the other issue is that it's not just, when you talk about gas and oil companies, you're not just talking about BP or ExxonMobil or Shell or Gulf or whatever. You're talking about a lot of smaller companies that are also in this business, whose margins in some ways are even tighter than
We're talking 2-3% and of profit, right? For their profit margin. So yes, they're making billions, but if you look at how much they did, That's really small margins. We should be, if we're going to be angry at somebody, go and be angry at people selling bottled water, right? I mean, you look at
Right.
the
Yeah.
right, that's where we're really insane. So yeah, it's not this innate greediness, and it's a misunderstanding of how the market works. And the heart and soul of the oil and gas industry, especially in Texas, is smaller operators. And that's why I want to get in there and make sure that the regulations are accurately and fairly applied, not just who's making big huge campaign contributions to PACs and to the politicians directly. Like, that's pay to play, and we can do better than that.
Right. And Sarah, I mean, my point on this is that there just really isn't a ton of cash that's floating around, even with gas at this high of a price. There's not a ton of cash that's just floating around that you can just use. Oh, well, they made $10 billion this year. They can plow it into the leases and exploration. It's not really how this works.
Right.
And especially for some of the smaller independent operators out there, you do need investors to put that money up front. And when you're looking at the price of gas, it looks like people are making money hand over fist, but the problem is that it's more expensive to get to the retailers, because it's more expensive coming out of the refiners, because it's more expensive for them to do that work. This is not just profiteering.
Windfall profits, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the Democratic agenda of saying we're just going to take all these as windfall profits and tax them is pretty ridiculous.
Right. Right. It really is a vast oversimplification of a very complicated industry. And again, it's one of the reasons why it matters who the regulators are in each of these. Well, at the federal level, it matters greatly, but also in the states. And again, most states, I don't think, actually have elected regulators. Texas does. So we'll bring it back to the runoff election, because I know that we really want to talk about that with you. Is the necessity of having somebody in there who understands the nuts and bolts of this, because it does really require some expertise to help calculate what is effective regulation as opposed to what is over and under regulation. And we're Republicans, so we talk about overregulation all the time. So I'll ask you this: what are the risks of underregulation in Texas in regards to energy policy?
Right. So what I'm afraid of right now is that if we don't clean house internally within the state of Texas, that the feds come in and they take back their delegation. So they've delegated their authority to protect groundwater and air and all these environmental things through the state's regulatory agencies, the Railroad Commission, the TCEQ, right? Like, all of these different entities have various responsibilities that have been delegated. And if we don't properly manage it, then the state of Texas won't have jurisdiction over the 50,000 injection wells. We'll have 50,000 holes in the ground that you can't do anything with, because I think we only have something like 21, not 1,000, 21 total federally permitted injection wells, right? So
Right.
all of those are made through state delegation. And if the state doesn't enforce it properly and the feds come in, because we've seen that before in jails and things like this, right? Where they and in Oklahoma, they shut down their injection because they didn't get their earthquakes under control. So I hope, look, there's lots of great experts that work within the agency. I don't want to come in and change the personnel, right? Like, they're just trying to do their jobs. I want to come in and bring the intellectual honesty that says, look, the regulations that we have on the book are sufficient. Let's actually enforce them fairly, predictably, and let's enable and empower the staff that's already there, that actually already understands all the field operations, that's already out there, that already knows who the bad operators are, right? They're just
Right.
not empowered because from the top down, there's pressure for favors and for, gimmies, and for not calling attention to bad stuff. And instead, we've got to actually penalize the bad operators so that the good operators can continue doing what they're doing, and that the bad operators, it's no longer profitable to be lying, cheating, and stealing. And that's the problem.
All right, so tell us about what's coming up on your calendar. I know that tonight, and this is prior to we're going to publish this on Thursday's show, but I know that you're going to be in Round Rock. You mentioned that at the very top of the interview. What else do you have on your schedule that you're looking forward to, maybe over the upcoming weekend where people can find you and come out and listen to you talk and perhaps debate some of these topics.
Yeah, so actually this Sunday, I'm going to be in Houston at the Harris County Family GOP Picnic. And if
Wow.
people want to see my schedule, they can go to sarah4rrc.com, or they can scan the little QR code that's actually on my background right there, and it'll take them to it. And it has my events, and you'll see a schedule when I'm in your area. And I'd love to meet you. And look, I'm very accessible. So if people have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm the TikTok lawyer. I'm the TikTok lawyer. I can't. I'm the unicorn lawyer on TikTok. And it's Sarah4RRC on Twitter. And you can direct message me on Twitter.
Sarah4RRC on Twitter, at Sarah4RRC on Twitter. Sarah4RRC.com is her website. And again, that's where you can find out all the different things that are going on. And again, if you're in Texas, the runoff date is May 24th. That is coming up fast, folks. So you have to be prepared for this. I mean, I voted in my first Texas election this year. So this is now going to be my first runoff election, I guess.
Yeah. And so and don't forget, there's some municipal elections on May 7th. So people are going to be thinking, wow, we've been to the polls several times, but please keep at it. Every vote counts.
Hey, every vote counts. And this is why we have the franchise. So this is how we become a responsible, self-governing entity. And we want to make sure it stays that way. So, Sarah Stogner, thank you so much for being with us today. And again, Sarah4RRC.com is the website. And hopefully we'll get a chance to touch base with you before the actual runoff date.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Sarah. And stay tuned for more from the Ed Morrissey Show coming up next. Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Joining me today is Phil Kerpen, president of American Commitment. That's AmericanCommitment.org. And he is a man who has plenty of analysis on lots of different topics. Last week, Phil had a study out that showed the effects of masking in school districts, and which school districts had the most school disruptions and what the impact was from that. Phil, first off, welcome back. Always great to talk to you. But I was not shocked to see the results of this. I was shocked that it didn't get more coverage, though.
Well, it's really interesting, right? Because the entire winter, we probably heard about 1 billion times from the Department of Education and the CDC and their various, state and local equivalents, that if you wanted your kids to stay in school, then you had to mask them, and masks were going to keep schools open. And if you don't like mask mandates, you're going to hate school closures more. So put the masks on. And they said this as if it were received wisdom. And they said it over and over and over again. And, we're now here in April. And, we did have a lot of closures around the country in January and February, although, a fraction, obviously, of what we had the year before. And so you would think somebody would check their work. Maybe they'd come out and say, wait, here's what actually happened. Here's why we were right, or here's how we were wrong. And I kind of thought it was curious that they never did anything like that. They never told anyone what actually happened. They were extremely confident in their predictions, but they never came back around to say, and here's what actually happened. Here's what the data shows occurred in January and February. So we decided to do the work that the CDC and the Department of Education never did, which is to answer the question, what actually happened this winter with school closures, and did the mask districts have fewer closures, or did they have more? And as it turns out, they had more. They had more closures in the mask mandated districts, and we were able to get a hold of a data set from a company called Burbio that tracks school closures and mask policies very, very closely. It covers the 500 largest school districts in the country by enrollment, so it's a little less than half of all of the school kids in the country. It basically covers all of the urban and suburban districts of any significant size. And what we were able to find from looking at this data is that actually the mask mandated districts closed at a pretty significantly higher clip. 35% of mask mandated school districts had some kind of disruption, closure or remote instruction in January or February, versus just 11% of non-mask mandate districts. And if you looked at it in terms of the percentage of total student learning days that were lost, the difference was even greater. It was a little over 3% of total student learning days that were disrupted, lost to closure in the mask mandated districts versus 0.75 in the non-mask mandate districts. So it was 4 times the number of student days lost as a percentage of all student days in the mask mandated versus the mask optional districts. So I think that's a pretty definitive failure for the confident assertion that we got, from the Department of Education and the CDC that masks would keep schools open. It seems that if there's any connection at all, it was the opposite, that masks closed schools. And I don't think it's because masks made people get more COVID or anything like that. But I think that if you keep people on edge, if you keep people panicked and scared, then when you get into winter and you inevitably have the COVID outbreaks that you're going to have, you're more likely to get the panic reaction of a closure than you are in a place that's been more normal. And so I think that's probably why we had those results.
Phil, I mean, being a data guy, whenever I hear, gross numbers or percentages and all that kind of thing, I always, I wouldn't say I'm skeptical, but I always like to understand what the scales are, right? Just because I know I've worked with data for decades now in various different applications. And I think that I like the student closure days measure best because it eliminates the population issue. Because I would imagine that when you're looking at this data set, and it's one aspect that I was thinking about, there were probably a lot more districts that were mask mandated than weren't. And so one of the things that...
It's about 2/3, yeah.
Yeah, about 2/3. So when you're looking at that, the first thing you look at is, well, there's a more robust data set among the mask mandated school districts than there might be with the non-mask mandated school districts. First off, 2/3, 1/3 isn't too bad. I mean, that's not a big disparity anyway. But the idea of drilling it down to percentages, I think, but even better, the student, the lost student days measure, I think really drills down to a way to compare this while eliminating some of those, some of the data anomalies here. I mean, do you sense that as well? Do you think that that's really the most solid comparative measure that comes out of this study?
I think so. First of all, I think the fact that we limited the scope of the analysis to the 500 largest school districts on the front end also prevents a lot of potential issues because, first of all, just from data availability, we kind of had to do that. But even if we had data on a lot of the tiny rural districts around the country and something like that, I think there's so many dissimilarities that it becomes very difficult to get any kind of meaningful information out of that. So just doing the largest school districts, the 500 largest, I think from the start makes it a much sounder basis for comparison. And then, of course, to answer the question of did masks actually help keep schools open, you really do want to compare kind of on an overall percentage of disrupted days basis. So I do think that's the best metric. And it was my partner on this project, Josh Stevenson, came up with that. And he actually allowed for change within the study period. So it's based on the mask policy the week prior to a closure. And so there was some change, although not a lot of change actually over the 2 months in terms of mask policy changes. So he was able to capture all of that by doing this methodology. And the other thing is, of course, the closures in some places were just a couple of schools. In other places, it was an entire school system. And so you really wanted to be able to differentiate the number of students who were affected. And doing the percentage of student days allows us to capture that very effectively also and to weight everything kind of on a level playing field basis. So I think that's probably the best number. And as I said, it was about 4 times the percentage of student learning days that were disrupted in the mask mandated districts versus not masked. Although I would point out, and I think this is really important because I try not to be a bad news guy. I try to, when I can, be a good news guy. We were talking about 3% of student days lost in the masked districts versus 0.75% in the not masked in January and February, compared to a year earlier where it was probably 50% or 60%, right. Just some enormous number. So really every place made an enormous amount of progress in terms of keeping schools open in the winter, regardless of the local factors and the political pressures and everything else. But the masks don't appear to have been a help in that regard. And it really was a matter more than anything of, just the decision. If you wanted to keep schools open, you basically were able to do so, with some exceptions. You did have some absenteeism in some places that forced closures and that kind of thing, but those were relatively isolated. They were short. They didn't affect large numbers of people. And so, if you decide that you want your schools to be open, COVID in terms of actually causing absenteeism and short staffing was not really going to be a major source of disruption, as much as we saw a lot of headlines about that. In the context of what we saw overall this winter, it was very small numbers.
Well, and Phil, I mean, you should be. I mean, you mentioned the fact that these are all expected outcomes. I might say that I was surprised that there was that much of a difference in terms of lost student days between mask mandated districts and non-mask mandated districts. I would have assumed going into this that the masks would have made no difference at all. So I would have expected those numbers to be pretty closely aligned.
You got to understand though, the places there's sort of a hidden variable here, which is politics. Okay?
Right.
I think that the places that are willing to close, that were still willing to close schools, proactively, not because of a staffing shortage, just because, oh no, there's lots of COVID, let's close schools. The places that were still willing to do that, which, the good news is they were much fewer and farther between than they were the year before. But the places that were still willing to do that are the very left-wing places where there's dominant teachers unions. And they were also, pretty much certain to be masked. And so I think that there's sort of that, it's not necessarily that masks drove closures. It's that the psychology and the mentality of sort of the large proactive closures was really only going to exist in places that were still masking.
Well, and I think so. If we're looking at what the actual impact of COVID was in terms of keeping classrooms open, not necessarily keeping students in school, but keeping classrooms open, right? You got to look at the non-mask mandate data on that. I mean, and I think we can extrapolate this backwards to what we were seeing the previous year and get an idea of just how much of that loss was unnecessary. Right. Yeah. I mean, you don't have
a really good point. If you assume that, it's obviously a simplifying assumption, but if you kind of assume that, the closures that happened in kind of the non-mask mandate districts were probably closures for out of practical necessity. Like they didn't have the staff, they didn't have the bus drivers, whatever it was, they had to close for those days, as opposed to it being kind of still largely a political decision in some of the mask places. And if you assume that's the case, you could say, okay, maybe the actual forced closures, if you will, are somewhere around 0.75% of, student learning in a really bad COVID winter like we had this past January and February. And then you kind of compare that to what we did the year before, where it was, probably 50% or more. And nearly all of that was a political decision. It was not dictated by the virus and its actual effects, because we had higher COVID infection rates this winter than we did the previous winter.
But with a more virulent, but less, but more benign. I don't want to call it benign. Benign is not really the right word, but a less lethal, much less lethal form, a variant of COVID-19, which is part of the context that you have to wrap into your policy.
I'm sure, I think when we talk about the school disruptions, it's really more about the, they're really driven more by just the number of positive tests that come up or the number of infections, not so much the acuity, because children were almost always very low acuity, even with the previous versions of the virus that were much worse for older people than what we're seeing right now. And so it's, I think it just became part of this idea of, you can't allow it to spread. You can't have schools be responsible for whatever's happening in the community. And so I don't know that the severity of the different strains played into this much, except to the extent, that it kind of affected the broader context.
Well, but I mean, it should have. I mean, this is part of what I think the data is showing. First off, the data is showing, especially in non-mask mandated schools, and I think that's what you have to rely on for this particular takeaway. But it just shows that schools, which we already knew, are not vectors for COVID-19. And are not vectors for community transmission, and the kids themselves don't get sick. If you look at the CDC data, which is correlative, by the way, still not causative. It's been correlative the entire time. You take a look at the death rates, right, for COVID-19 among the different age groups, and until you get to the Omicron variant, where it's entirely correlative, right? People, kids that were dying had been exposed to the Omicron variant, but they weren't dying from COVID. It was zeros all the way down the line until December of last year. If you take a look at the data, and even with Omicron correlation, you're still talking about 0.03, correlation rate, 0.12 correlation rate. School kids just simply weren't getting acutely sick with this.
Well, I
And
like to think about it a little differently, which is to say the burden of respiratory disease among children never increased during the pandemic.
yes,
It's not to say that COVID was completely harmless to children. That's not the case. It certainly resulted in hospitalizations and deaths among children, but they were no greater than we see with all of the other viruses that children typically deal with. And so,
right.
unlike with the older population, where we had this dramatic increase in the pandemic period of respiratory illness and death, among children, it really was sort of a replacement effect.
Yep.
It replaced the other viruses that they would have otherwise had, and so there was no elevated danger for children really at any point in the pandemic.
So when we're looking at the data here, we can pretty much say that masks really didn't make a difference in terms of transmission. Masks didn't make a difference at all. In fact, had a negative impact. The impulse to mandate masks, I should say mask mandates, because we've got to be very specific about what we're measuring here. Mask mandates didn't really keep schools open. In fact, the impulse to have those mandates probably wasn't overcome by the mask mandates themselves in trying to shut these things down. This is a failed policy, right? I mean, this is an entirely failed policy when it's applied to schools.
Yeah, I think so. And the disappointing thing is we've got these policymaking bodies that recommended it that show no interest in reviewing the results of their own recommendations and no interest in reconsidering them. And I think that, we're unlikely to see school mask mandates come back, I think, ahead of this election, just based on sort of political logic. But when we get into the winter again, I think in the places where Democrats have the power to make the decisions, they're more likely to repeat their mistakes than they are to admit that they were mistakes. And unless you force that reckoning and come with the data and really bring a lot of pressure to bear, unfortunately, I think that some of these things are going to recur. And some of these some places, I don't know, has St. Paul lifted it, or do they still have masks on the kids there?
Well, I wouldn't know because I don't live there anymore.
Okay, well,
Phil,
yeah,
I'm in Texas.
They might still have them on.
I'm in Texas, man.
I didn't know that. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, we moved here about 10 months ago. So
St. Paul, the last time I checked, was still masking kids in school. So they were one of the bitter enders.
Right. And I think with the CDC guidelines the way they are, they're going to continue. If that's still the case, they're probably not going to change it anytime soon either. And I know your study doesn't address this, but let's just spend a couple of minutes talking about the potential detrimental impacts of masking kids in schools. I mean, there's developmental impacts, there's psychological impacts, there's social impacts that the CDC doesn't really take into consideration, that policymakers haven't taken into consideration. And when you look at those, which are quantifiable now, I think there's been studies done that quantify some of these things. It even makes the case for mask mandating even less rational.
Well, look, I mean, I think, before COVID, most schools would have prohibited masks even on Halloween because they're disruptive to the learning environment. Kids need to be able to see faces and to communicate in a normal, non-disrupted way. And I think that the lack of normal life for children is going to have profound long-term negative consequences, and part of that is the mask mandates. And I think that for younger children in particular, there's also a major educational and developmental effect because it's so important for language development and communication skills to see the face of the person you're talking to and to connect sounds with mouth movements. And so I think we're going to continue to see major fallout in terms of speech and language deficits in particular. And that's sort of the most obvious effect. But I also think that there are broader sort of educational and social emotional harms just associated with kids not having normal life, normal social interaction. And that's going to be a little bit more difficult, both to kind of predict the implications of, but also, sort of to fix and to get out of and to address. Eventually, you would hope that you could remediate the language and communication issues, although for some children it may be difficult to reach them, and it may be difficult to do that. But this broader idea of, kids having lost years of their life that were just extremely abnormal in their social interactions, that could be more challenging and more subtle in terms of its negative long-term consequences.
Well, and I think we're going to be dealing with that over the long term. I mean, you're talking about, an entire nation of children. Well, especially in like the blue states. For instance, the red states, I think they were masking in the very first wave, right? And then you go into summer. When they came back in the fall, a lot of the red states stopped masking students in school at that point. More of them joined up as the 2020-2021 school year went along. And in 2021, I think by September of 2021, none of the red states were doing forced masking. I mean,
they were like two different universes. Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that's remarkable is, you had all of these so-called experts saying, it's very dangerous. You can't have schools without masks. Then you say, but like half the world does, including half of this country, and they've had no adverse consequence of any significance, and they didn't want to see it. They didn't want to see what was going on. And one of the really, I think that one of the underappreciated aspects of COVID is that people who live in different areas had wildly different experiences, and yet they don't necessarily know their experience wasn't universal. And so, here in the DC area, in Maryland in particular, we had the longest school closures, I think, anywhere in the country, or maybe tied with California. And, so you had people who lost, 3/4 of a school year in many cases. But then they were happy to be back. And, even though it was masked, okay, we're back. And the parents didn't necessarily appreciate that didn't happen everywhere, that it wasn't like that. And so, I think you've got some fragmentation in terms of how people experience these things. So they don't necessarily know how different it was in other places. But, I'll tell you, one of the silver linings that I expect, I think this could be the most significant silver lining out of everything related to COVID is we are seeing a pushback against kind of received educational wisdom in a way that's much stronger and broader than we've ever seen before in this country.
Yeah.
And the parents who are in the places that were most affected by this stuff are, a lot of them are angry, and they want major reforms. They want school choice programs. They want control over their local school board. They're concerned about curriculum that they saw for the first time when they were looking at a computer over their kid's shoulder. And so there are a lot of broader positives, I think, in terms of kind of the backlash that we've seen on education, and kind of holding that coalition together to push for some broader changes is going to be important as the COVID stuff finally eases out, even in the blue areas. But I think that's going to be a silver lining. And then I think the other silver lining is we're potentially going to have a generation of kids that grow up to be the most skeptical generation of government authority in the history of this country. And I think that could be a very helpful thing as well.
Could be a very helpful thing. I will tell you what, if I was a social science analyst, which, I kind of am, just being in politics. But I mean, if I was somebody who was, involved in, the research end of social science, I'd be sharpening my pencils and getting my plans ready for studies of the differential outcomes of children, especially those that were in elementary and middle schools during the mask mandates, and looking at your data and then tracking what the performance levels were going to be when they got into higher education. Because I suspect that what you're going to find is that the kids that were really forced to mask up and do remote learning more often are going to be less able to integrate socially into those higher education settings. They're going to be less able to compete in those. And you're going to see a really big differential impact where success in education is really going to be regional for a while, maybe for a 10-year period or so.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. Of course, the other sort of cross-cutting factor in that is, parental engagement and income level, and that kind of thing. Because I think that you're going to see the upper income, the middle to upper income people, even if their kids were badly disrupted, they'll find a way to catch up, or, they'll get they'll do whatever they have to.
Right.
But it's
So-
lower income people who don't have necessarily access to, enrichment resources and summer schools and special programs and so forth. That's where you're going to see the gap grow. And that's also, I think, where you're going to see a potential major increase in dropouts. Because remember, a lot of high schools were closed during this also, and people don't even necessarily know where those kids were, where they did during that. And I think that relates also to the increase we've seen in crime and drugs and just a lot of other social pathologies.
Yep, and it also reaffirms to us what we suspected all along, was that the impact of this was going to be very sharply regressive, and it is going to be the poor and working class kids. They're going to wind up suffering most because of this, and that's whether you're in red states or blue states. That's going to be the case. Primarily, though, in blue states, because that's where most of these impacts took place. All right, Phil Kerpen is at American Commitment. That's AmericanCommitment.org. You can find some of the data there, and also some of the other great stuff that they're doing at AmericanCommitment.org. You should just check in there. Right now, there's Senator Rand Paul is introducing Senate Resolution 37, which will block and ban the mandate that you must wear a mask on airplanes and public transportation.
We actually won that fight yesterday, as
Yep.
you know. And that's an issue we've been working on for a long time. So it was a little bit gratifying to get a victory, although, we've been trying so hard to get a House vote because we were able to pass that in the Senate. Actually, 8 Democrats voted for it. It's a very bipartisan Senate vote. And we've been, for the last 6 weeks, we've been trying to get a House vote, and Nancy Pelosi is nowhere to be found. And Steny Hoyer, I think, we're looking at it. We're not sure whether we're going to have a vote or not. And it looks like, thanks to this judge in Florida, we've won on that issue, but we never did get the House members on the record, unfortunately.
Well, let's ask about that just really briefly before we let you go, Phil, because, I think certainly I'm going to suspect that Rand Paul is going to agree with me on this. One of the lessons here, I think, is that you want to make sure in the future that these agencies have their authority limited up front and very explicitly. So
Right.
Is there going to be room here for Senator Paul or members of the House and Senate to craft a bill which makes these takes these and makes these much more explicit, makes Congress that it clarifies what Congress's intent in the enabling statutes, modifies the enabling statutes.
I would really hope so. This is one of the big problems we have, across really almost every policy area in the federal government is Congress passes these broad, vague laws, and they sort of sit on the books until some agency decides it's time to, enact whatever major policy, the administration wants that day. And we've seen this with, global warming policies at EPA and now at the SEC, and we've seen it with all the labor policies at the Department of Labor and the NLRB and so forth. And obviously during COVID, it went to a brand new level with all the things that CDC did. And we've got kind of this backwards system instead of the way the Constitution says it's supposed to work, where you pass a new law, a new major policy is passed with a new law that passes the House and Senate is signed by the president. We have essentially this backwards system where the executive branch does almost anything unless you can somehow muster enough votes to stop them in the House and the Senate. And then if there's a veto, you need to have 2/3 in the House and the Senate to stop them. And so we've sort of inverted our constitutional system. And I would really like to see a focus in Congress on slimming down all of these laws on the front end to say, if you want to do X, Y, and Z, you've got to come to us for permission rather than you just do it and we try to muster the votes to somehow stop you. Because I think we've really got an inversion of our constitutional system when it comes to making these policies.
I agree. And that gets down to all sorts of issues with agency law. But that's a topic for another Phil Kerpen appearance on the Ed Morrissey Show, because we're kind of out of time on this one. Phil, it just means you got to come back and do this again with us.
Happy to do it.
All right. Phil Kerpen, AmericanCommitment.org. Thanks for being with us. Stay tuned for more from the Ed Morrissey Show. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for watching the Ed Morrissey Show podcast edition. If you like what you've seen, be sure to subscribe at the channels that you watched on: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We love subscribers. More importantly, it lets everybody know that we're out there. So again, thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe.